Welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. Did you know there are many ways you can interact with us at thehistorynetwork.org? There's a nice shiny donate button on the website homepage if you feel the urge at all. Thanks for all who have done so recently. And we also sell our past seasons through the store link on the website for just £2 each. Each season lasts anywhere from around 3 to 5 hours, depending on which one it is. And these files are all nicely chaptered and downloadable, so what could be easier? You can also find us on Facebook. Search for The History Network on there. On Twitter, we are at History Network, and you can find our YouTube channel at youtube.com/user/The History Network. We also produce the podcast for Ancient Warfare magazine, so if ancient history is your thing, it's ancient-warfare.com if you want to find out more about that. And Angus has his own podcast looking at World War II specifically, and he gets into discussion with a guest on a chosen subject each month, and so far episodes have included the Java Sea campaign, gliders, the German Stug, Red Cross parcels, the OSS, the Dieppe raid, 1942, to name a few. Do go and take a look and support Angus in that endeavour by going to www.podcast.com. Links to all of the aforementioned at the website, of course. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 22, Episode 3, The Battle of Borodino. The fighting on the 7th of September 1812 would be the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic War. The French victory would open the road to Moscow, but the failure to finally smash the Russians in the field would ultimately prove fatal for Napoleon's Grande Armée. When the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River in June of 1812, it was at its peak, numbering over 600,000 soldiers. For once, Napoleon had prepared logistic support for the campaign, aware of the vast expanse he had to cross to reach Moscow and the numbers he had to feed on the way. What he hadn't expected was the Russian refusal to fight a major engagement in which he, Napoleon, could make his knockout blow. Instead, like Quintus, Fabius, Maximus, Verrucosus, who commanded the legions against Hannibal in the Second Punic War, they refused to fight. They withdrew, orchestrating skirmishes and minor battles. They destroyed crops and stored food as they pulled back. Depriving Napoleon's men meant reliance on their own ever-lengthening supply chain. This Fabian strategy worked on a number of levels. It allowed the initially outnumbered Russian army to fall back and regroup, drawing in their scattered forces. At the same time, Napoleon's army diminished in size. Troops needed to be left to garrison key locations that had been captured. The endless marching, poor opportunity for foraging, led to men receiving meagre rations. Morale dropped, especially in those units that were not French. These units saw desertion rates steadily rise. Summer heat and diseases were also common to the military of that age, and ailments such as dysentery brought down men in their droves. The horses fared little better. It's estimated up to 50,000 came with the Grande Armée. The further they went, the less fodder was available, as even the grass began to be thinned out. Naturally, the first horses had the best grazing, but those bringing up the rear would have meagre availability of grazing, if anything. By the end of the first month, over 10,000 horses had died. Facing, or in this instance looking over his shoulder at, Napoleon, was Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, a man of curious background. He was only the second generation of his family to be accepted into the Russian nobility. Born in Livonia, now divided between Estonia and Latvia, he was somewhere in his family's past of Scottish descent. He had served in the Russian army for 14 years before becoming an officer. It was de Tolly whose strategy it was to withdraw deeper into Russia, pulling the French after him. It was unpopular at the time, and quite understandably so, as swathes of land was destroyed with this scorched earth tactic. Voices of dissent grew as the Russian forces pulled back. The Tsar, Alexander I, also itched for a decisive encounter, which is exactly what Napoleon wanted. De Tolly continued his withdrawal, all the time gathering his forces. At Smolensk, Napoleon made a rush to try and cut him off. The manoeuvre failed. The clash of armies was only limited, with each side managing to get to the field around 50 to 60,000 men. In the process of the battle, the city was destroyed, denying the French a potential supply base for an army already critically low on rations. With the loss of Smolensk, the Tsar decided he needed a commander who would stand and fight. De Tolly was removed from direct command of the whole army and replaced with Prince Kutuzov, who came out of retirement for the job. This old warrior had fought the French at Ulm and was the Russian commander at Austerlitz. He had a reputation for fighting, had been wounded numerous times, but most importantly, he was popular. Yet he appreciated the position de Tolly was in, and continued to withdraw, but he knew he was expected to stand and fight. It was just 70 miles, around 110 kilometres, west of Moscow that Kutuzov decided to turn and make his stand near the small village of Borodino. Clausewitz writes of the Russian terrain, "Russia is very poor in positions for battles. Where the great morasses prevail, the country is so wooded that one has trouble to find room for a considerable number of troops. Where the forests are thinner, as between Smolensk and Moscow, the ground is level, without any decided mountain ridges, without any deep hollows. The fields are without enclosures, therefore everywhere is easy to be passed, the villages of wood and ill-adapted for defence." Borodino was the best defensible position to hand for Kutuzov. Far from perfect, it did straddle both the old and new Smolensk-Moscow roads, and streams and rivers would help protect the defenders' flanks, hampering the attackers' movement. With the arrival of his army, he quickly threw up 3 redoubts, though Clausewitz was of low opinion of them. They were in a sandy soil, open behind, destitute of all external devices, and could therefore only be considered as individual features in a scheme for increasing the defensive capabilities of the position. None of them could hold out against a serious assault. To the west was the village of Borodino, sitting on top of a small hill, straddling the new Smolensk-Moscow road. To the north on a rise were the Raevsky redoubts, protecting the Russian right flank. Here were positioned 18 cannon. It was expected that Napoleon would see de Tolly commanding the First Army on the right and go straight for the main threat. The Russians could then attack in force from their left. These redoubts in the centre of the Russian line would be the linchpin of the Russian defence. To the south were built 3 fortified earthworks, the Bagration flèches. The Shevardino redoubt was built out in front of the Russian line. The traditional narrative argues this was an observation post and a threat to the French advance. Another opinion is that it was built in haste, wrongly positioned because the line of defence was built further back, leaving it isolated. Irrespective of why it was built, it was here that first contact was made with the French. On viewing the Russian dispositions, Napoleon decided to attack the Russian centre between both Russian armies. His losses might be great, but he bargained it would give him the knockout victory he needed, and the losses would be justified. This would mean the French infantry attacking en masse over open ground. The forces available to both sides were almost even, with the attacking French numbering up to 190,000 and the defending Russians 160,000. but the Russians outgunned the French with 624 to 587 guns. Napoleon was finally going to get a chance at his knockout battle. As the sun set on the evening of 5th of September 1812, 35,000 French troops set out to assault the isolated Borodino redoubt, still under construction with 1.5-metre unreinforced wall and some incomplete embrasures. Work on a ditch had only just begun, but in the immediate vicinity to defend the position the Russians had 18,000 men. Under murderous musket fire the French managed to bring forward 4 guns. At close range they opened fire with grape shot ripping through the Russian defenders, forcing them to withdraw from the position. The Russians now fed in reserves, giving their forces an extra impetus as they counter-attacked, successfully retaking the redoubt. The Russian cavalry charged down the 111th French Infantry Regiment, slaughtering them. Darkness only added to the confusion as the fighting continued into the night. By midnight it was clear to the Russians that large numbers of fresh French reinforcements were closing in, and they finally abandoned the position. It had been a bloody fight, with the Russians losing around 6,000 and the French 5,000 men. The next day saw a lull as both sides manoeuvred their troops into position. Contrary to Russian expectations, Napoleon concentrated his forces with 2/3 of his army facing the Russian left flank. At 0600 on the morning of September the 7th, 1812, French gunners opened fire and the French infantry was soon advancing. The first assault was on the village of Borodino, as Prince Eugene's 4th Corps stormed the Russian positions, catching the Russians unaware and routing them in just minutes. At the end of the Russian line to their left, the French attacked the flèches. Casualties mounted as they approached the Russian emplacements. Marshal Devout had his horse shot from under him, whilst General Compans was hit in the shoulder and could take no further part in the battle, carried from the battlefield after just 90 minutes. The redoubt fell. To support the left flank, de Tolly allowed the 1st Army Reserve to be rushed across the battlefield in support of the troubled left flank. Other nearby reserves were pressed forward. The French were repelled from the flèches after a ferocious counter-attack. In the centre, the first French attack was put in against the formidable Revsky redoubts, with Russian infantry supporting the guns in the redoubt itself. The attack was easily repulsed. The redoubt would become a focal point of the battle as Napoleon pushed more and more men and material against the position. The French infantry put in attack after attack throughout the day. Cavalry would be thrown in at one point because there was no infantry left and a gap had appeared in the French line. The cost would be enormous. On the Russian left flank, the French prepared once more to assault around the flèches. Wave after wave went forward. Fighting was bitter and confused. Davat's cavalry was sent in. The French brought forward over 200 guns. They were wreaking havoc on the Russians, but that paled under withering fire from the 300 guns based in the flèches. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, was wounded 4 times during this period of the battle. The Russian soldiers proved their mettle that day. They stubbornly stood against their French counterparts. One Russian officer described the fighting. There are no words to describe the bitter despair with which our soldiers threw themselves into the fray. It was a fight between ferocious tigers, not men, and once both sides had determined to win or die where they stood, they did not stop fighting when their muskets broke, but carried on using butts and swords in terrible hand-to-hand combat, and the killing went on. When the Russian General Bagration had to be carried wounded from the field, the troops to the left of the flèches lost heart and withdrew, but this wasn't a rout, so when Marshal Murat launched a huge cavalry charge hoping to break them, they were able to form orderly squares and repel the assaults. Napoleon continued to deploy his reserves until just before noon he had committed all but the Old Guard, which he held back. He refused to throw them into the fray. Ordering them to attack may end in their destruction, or it could swing the tide of battle. But Napoleon needed some functioning units, especially if the battle was being lost. He was a long way from home. The Old Guard were the backbone of the army, but he hesitated over their use. The fighting now bogged down, and the Russians reinforced their weakening left flank, whilst at the same time launching a cavalry attack on their right, recapturing Borodino. In the afternoon, 3 French infantry divisions, under cover of 400 artillery pieces, once more attacked the Raevski redoubts. A cavalry attack was ordered to the south of the defences. The aim was to punch through the Russian line and attack the position from the rear. Breaking into the redoubt, they slaughtered the defenders. With the arrival of French infantry, their hold on the position was secured. The Russians decided against a counter-attack and withdrew their line back. Before the French could seize the opportunity to throw cavalry into the newly appeared gap in the Russian line, created by the fall of the redoubts, they were blocked as de Tolly rushed in fresh cavalry to cover the retreating infantry. Russian infantry formed squares, and the whole opposing cavalry forces attacked around them as they withdrew. With the Russian army now falling back on the right wing, a final cavalry assault on the Russian left caused them also to withdraw back to the new positions. Both sides were now exhausted, and the fighting petered out in the late afternoon. The Russians had been forced out of their prepared positions, but crucially the army was not routed and still a viable fighting force. When the casualty rate became known, Kutuzov decided to withdraw early the next day. The victory was Napoleon's. The road to Moscow was now open, but at what cost? 35,000 French dead, wounded and captured, including 47 generals. The Russians, 45,000 dead, wounded and captured. The Russians fought with a smaller army. It hadn't been smashed. Her troops had fought bravely. Kutuzov, in many respects, had done well. Napoleon would later write, "Of the 50 battles I have fought, the most terrible was that before Moscow. The French showed themselves to be worthy victors, and the Russians can rightly call themselves invincible." The scale of the losses at Borodino would not be seen again for another 100 years, until the First World War. History would prove it to be a Pyrrhic victory for the French. It's ironic after the loss at Borodino that the plan that saved Russia was that of Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, withdrawing, allowing the French to take Moscow without a fight, but not before the Russians had set it alight. Moscow was the high-water mark of the French advance. From here it would be the cold, bitter retreat in the Russian winter. De Tolly's tactic that was so despised at the time eventually won the war in Russia, and is subsequently seen as a work of genius. Would you like to write a script for us? Many of our most popular episodes have been written by listeners, and whether you feel like putting a script together or whether you'd simply like to suggest some subjects for us to cover, we would love to hear from you. And it's info@thehistorynetwork.org for that, so do get in touch. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Angus Wallace, read by Nick Barker.